Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of the Forum. Today we'll be discussing the means and methods of warfare and the restrictions imposed by international humanitarian law in this regard. I'm delighted to have with us Dr. Saadia Zahoor. Dr. Zahoor is an expert in international law and has served on the faculty of Bahri University and has also served at the Legal and Treaties Wing of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. So, Dr. Saadia, I wanted to start with asking you a very basic question, a fundamental question about the means and methods of warfare. When we say that international humanitarian law restricts the means and methods of war, what do we mean by this statement?
So the whole idea of IHL is to make sure that civilians are protected and to make sure that even combatants suffer less during the armed conflict. So the basic principle is that the means and methods of warfare are not unlimited. The choice is limited. So you have to make sure that you choose within those options that the Geneva Conventions and IHL generally gives you. We talk about means and methods, so we have to divide both of them and explain both of them. So methods are the tactics, the way the war have been conducted, or the tactics used during the war. Strategies.
Okay.
So and then there are certain principles that dictate that you just can't commit certain crimes. For example, you can't use certain strategies. For example, you can't commit perfidy. You can't use MLMs of the international organization, including ICRC and UN. Mm-hmm. You can't use the flag for the truce and misuse it. So these are the things. These are the strategies which are prohibited.
So things like faking a surrender. Or wearing. So perfidy, if you could slightly explain that concept.
So perfidy is to get the confidence of the people that they are being protected or they enjoy the protection under international law. And then after getting that confidence from those people and when they surrender themselves or anything, and then you use force against them or kill them or arrest them or those things.
So would this also include, for example, wearing the uniform of the
Absolutely.
opposing force?
Yes. So there's a principle that you have to understand is that the ruses of war are allowed, but perfidy is not.
Ruses of war. Tricks and stuff.
Tricks. For example, camouflage is allowed.
Okay.
However, if you're using the insignia of, for example, ICRC and try to show to the enemy that you are protected, that's a perfidy that you can't commit.
I see.
So the idea is that you are telling the other person that you are something else. And the other person giving you leaving you and giving the confidence, perform a certain act, and then you
trusting you on that.
Trusting you on that.
I see.
That's prohibited. So there are other things, pillage, for example, taking hostages. When there is a enemy property, for example, enemy weapons, that you are allowed to take, but otherwise, looting the cities after the conquest is prohibited. So certain acts and strategies are not allowed in war, and that's why we have a prohibition on the methods of warfare. And similarly, the means of warfare. So there are weapons and weapon systems and platforms that are applied during the armed conflict, and there's also prohibition. For example, we have nuclear weapons, we have chemical weapons and landmines and biological weapons. These are prohibited, and the reason is because there are fundamental principles in IHL which you have to remember always, regardless of the weapon. So for example, proportionality or the distinction. So if there is a weapon which is a weapon of mass destruction, you will not be able to distinguish between civilian or combatant. So such a weapon will be prohibited regardless of whether there is a treaty or there's a customary law or not. But whenever there is a weapon, you have to make sure that it fulfills the condition that IHL lays down in different provisions and in customary international law, and in some cases even with specific treaties.
No, absolutely. And one interesting question that comes up is nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
And so are nuclear weapons also considered, because they are a weapon of mass destruction, also to be considered unlawful or restricted by IHL?
I think that's an interesting history with the nuclear weapons. So obviously, I hope most of the people will be aware of 1996 advisory opinion of the ICJ, where actually ICJ said that it's not prohibited per se, but it is against the principle of international humanitarian law. So a lot of people interpreted it as that no, they are not prohibited. But the basic principles of distinctions, you can't, when you use nuclear weapon, you just cannot ensure that there is a distinction between combatant and civilians. So or civilian objects or combatant military objects. So there was a fundamental question, regardless whether there is a treaty or not. It was prohibited under international humanitarian law. However, now that we also have a treaty, which actually just few months back came into force, and now they are actually to experiment or to use them or stockpile them is prohibited under international law. Obviously, that's some people might still question whether they are prohibited under the customary international law, but with regard to IHL principles and customary international humanitarian law, they are prohibited.
No, absolutely. I think that's it's a very interesting way the law is developing in this regard. But it's certainly one of those difficult questions to deal with, because how are you going to get a purely military target when you have a weapon with such a large footprint?
Exactly.
So that becomes an issue. I wanted to move on to something that is looking at this restriction. So we have it in the Geneva Conventions or in the Hague Regulations, historically, these prohibitions. But when it comes to practical war fighting, and we've heard the term, all is fair in love and war, and I've had a student actually write that in his exam paper on IHL as well. But how do commanders in the field make determinations or take decisions regarding, what means and methods are acceptable and what are not?
So there are two principles, the two arguments that I want to give. The first is that Article 35 of the Additional Protocol 1, which is primarily about international armed conflict, but it's also part of the customary international law, which says that whenever there is any means and methods of warfare, new means and methods of warfare, you have to judge them on the basis of the basic principles. So the principles are not applicable only on the technology which was used in past or presently used. It's also for the principle will remain the same even for any sort of technology or means or methods.
So new weapons that are developed.
New weapons, yes, absolutely. So so that we have this idea that IHL only applies during armed conflict, but there is one provision, a couple of provisions, obviously, other than the things that are related to armed conflict. But the training part of IHL comes in hand and is applicable here. You have to train.
And this applies even when a state is not in armed conflict.
Absolutely.
In peacetime.
At peacetime, you have to train your people. You have to explain to them the principles so that when they are in actual armed conflict, they understand those principles will come handy to them. They should understand whether this means or this method or this weapon is actually prohibited under international law or not. Okay. So that's why this, the teaching of IHL and the trainings of IHL, both for civilians and military commanders, is important.
No, absolutely. I think that it's extremely important to understand that and we see this when it comes to your kinetic power ability, that you prepare for war in times of peace. But that goes as much for the legal requirements that you need to train your people in times of peace, so that when they're actually in war, they don't commit war crimes or
and there's another point also which is important, that people should also understand the consequences. If there is a law and they have to follow it, and then there will be consequences if they will not follow it. So in that term, it's also important that the consequences of not following international law and the commander responsibility, and all those principles should also be taught to all the people involved, possibly involved ever in armed conflict. And hence, I think what ICRC does over the period of time and during the peacetime in all countries is important. And regardless of international organization, state itself has to ensure that their people are well versed in international law.
Absolutely. And I think you touched upon the issue of domestic accountability mechanism. I think that's also very, very important, that the consequences aren't just that there will be the International Criminal Court that is going to deal with you. The first obligation is on the state itself. If its soldiers are involved in war crimes, then they have to be held accountable.
Absolutely.
And I think at times, especially in South Asia, where we have such polarizing and problematic issues, this thing is often lost. That the primary responsibility on holding people accountable for the types of war crimes that are done or violations of IHL is on the state itself.
Absolutely.
And only then the secondary.
I just want to add this point. Even with International Criminal Court, the principle still is that if the state is not willing or is not capable of putting their own people accountable, only then international organization or international court will interfere. Otherwise, it's the responsibility of the state, first and foremost, to make sure that people are held accountable for any sort of atrocities against their own people or against the people of other countries.
Absolutely. No, and I think that brings us to our next point. What are some of the if people do violate the means and methods of, the restrictions on the means and methods of warfare, what does this result in? What are the consequences that can practically come out from this?
So the first thing is that important thing is that whenever there are human rights violation, so there is a history that will judge you, and there are countries which are still struggling with the war crimes that they have committed during the First World War or Second World War, and even before that. So obviously there are consequences, and all the countries do fight this narrative war of narrative. So I think it's important that when you do anything wrong or any sort of you commit any sort of war crimes, there is a legacy that you will leave behind, and which your and it will take generations to fight, and and there will be consequences for that.
Absolutely.
The second thing is that obviously immediately UN Security Council can take action. There can be sanctions. There could be not only the UN sanctions, but also the possibility of sanctions by states and powerful states, and EU, for example, US sanctions, which can have huge economic and social and economic and political consequences for any country. And
so just on this point, I think the way we're seeing sanctions develop, these aren't just sanctions on a country; these are individual specific as well.
Absolutely, yes. US has a mechanism where they are actually putting sanctions. In EU and UK, where they're putting sanctions on individuals and companies who are involved in war crimes. We have seen the companies losing cases in Germany and France, where they were involved in some sort of war crimes or other atrocities,
funding ISIS,
and now the consequences are not just for the individual or the state or unknown entity. People are trying to figure out who was actually involved, and that include the businesses who are supporting or taking participation in the atrocities. So we have seen the universal jurisdiction, the mechanism of universal jurisdiction, where states are taking making people accountable for war crimes, crime against humanity, and genocide, and torture, basically.
Yes,
so people have to be careful. The consequences are huge, and then there are secondaries which little less consequential sanctions like travel bans and asset freeze, both for states and individuals. For individuals, it's also has huge consequences, but for states, we have seen certain countries facing the asset freeze in recent times.
Absolutely,
and there are huge financial consequences for those countries. Having said that, obviously there's a mechanism where UN has taken lead, UN Security Council, where they have established special tribunals for investigating and punishing war crimes and crime against humanity and genocide. We have seen it in former Yugoslavia, we have seen for Rwanda, we have seen hybrid mechanism for Lebanon, Sierra Leone, Cambodia. So there are a lot of mechanisms that a UN Security Council can initiate. And then there is a permanent court. Obviously, a lot of countries are still not member of International Criminal Court, but with ICC, we have seen that a lot of other countries have accepted their jurisdiction, and in some cases, they haven't accepted jurisdiction, but they have accepted the jurisdiction for a particular situation or for a particular time period, and that is also interesting. So states and the individuals should be careful when they are committing or making policies where they are indulging into war crimes or borderline committing or attempting to commit genocide. Also, there's another important factor. Sometimes we think that when it comes to ICC's accountability, it's only for the member states. So, for example, the jurisdiction is why we call it the almost universal jurisdiction, is because when sometimes that crime is committed on the territory of the member state, the individuals of the foreign who are involved in that particular armed conflict are also can be held responsible. So we have to be careful, and I think armed forces have to be careful when they are indulging into transnational armed conflicts, that their accountability they might not be national of the state party, but if they are committing any sort of war crimes on the territory of the state party, they might be held accountable.
So I mean, the Afghan investigation by the office of the prosecutor right now, I think that's a prime example.
Absolutely. And well, I think I should take this opportunity to condemn also what they have done with regard to their recent decision. Anyways, but that's actually in a way, as a student of international law, I also appreciate, because when you have a law, when you have a jurisdiction, ICC is in absolute, prosecutor is in absolute right that he can start investigation again and make sure that those who were, and we have to understand that there's only case in ICC's history so far where the jurisdiction is unlimited. It started off with the early 2000s and is still endless. endless. There is no end date for that.
Wow.
So everybody still involved in the conflict have to be very, very careful.
Ongoing.
And also have to remember that, for example, ICC cannot force a non-state party to hand over the culprits or accused, but the naming and shaming itself is so huge that you just cannot live with this, that a country is having a fugitive, but giving protection to fugitives or those who are involved in crimes. So I think states should
no, absolutely, and I think that's specifically why it was so disappointing to see that the prosecutor has just limited it now to the Afghan Taliban or those things, and there are very serious concerns that we've had over the last 2 decades of the role of US forces or ISAF forces in Afghanistan. So it's sad. Let's see how it is. I just hope that this is not a trend that the new prosecutor is going to be establishing.
So I think ICC also has to make sure that the people take them seriously. If there is a view that they are partial or funding is always an issue for ICC, but they can't make their decisions on the basis that the funding is not available for the half of the investigation and the rest of the half of the investigation cannot be covered by regardless. I think they have to make sure that they give confidence to people that they are a neutral organization and they are there to do justice and not pick and choose what is more important for them and what is not. And I think if they are making a decision, that should be purely based on the principles of law and not on the flimsy excuses of funding.
Absolutely. I fully agree with you on that. So moving on from accountability, I want to discuss, these, and you had touched upon issues of new weapons being developed. So 2 particular fields. One is cyber, warfare that's taking place, and there's an entire body of literature that is now being developed, but it's still in its, development phase. And then, of course, there's lethal autonomous weapon systems. So why don't we take this one by one? So when it comes to cyber warfare, if you will, what do you think? How is IHL going to develop to be able to tackle this?
So I think, again, both customary international law and Article 35 of Additional Protocol 1 have laid down this principle, as I mentioned earlier, that the principle, regardless of the new technology, the principle will remain the same. We will judge those technologies and the methods and means and methods based on the existing laws. Obviously, we will not say that the IHL or Geneva Conventions specifically deal with cyber warfare or cyber operation. However, the principles are there, and you can't say that they are cyber operations are being conducted in legal vacuum. There are principles, and they are governed. Obviously, we need binding principles, and I think there is an intense debate everywhere to make sure that we have some laws. And I hope that in future we will have some laws, because regardless of the technological development of states, a lot of states are suffering cyber attack, and a lot of them are actually using cyber operations as part of their kinetic warfare. So I think there are 3 specific situations that can emerge with use of cyber warfare. The first is when cyber operations are part of the otherwise kinetic operations. And in that case, obviously IHL will be applicable. So
you have a war going on,
yes,
and as part of,
ongoing
you have
war,
tanks rolling in, but you also have the cyber element to
yes.
it.
In that case, IHL will be applicable, because IHL actually deals with armed conflict. So anything that happens in armed conflict will be dealt by IHL. So that principle is settled, and I think more or less customary practices and state opinion are consistent on this, and there are hardly any major objection on this. The second is when there is actually no war, and then there is an independent cyber operation. And then here again we have 2 further subsections. The first one is when you have cyber operation and that results into physical destruction of your civilian assets. For example, your dams or your power plants or a hospital.
They're hacked into
it. And for example, the dams, the water has been switched to the level that, they actually cause the destruction of a dam, which cause further destruction of cities or civilian property. In that particular case, because the destruction is similar to the destruction caused by a bomb or any other kinetic operation, IHL will still be applicable. Here again, we have to be careful when we talk about the kinetic operation and armed conflict, because threshold for the international armed conflict will be different from that of the non-international armed conflict. So if I stick to international armed conflict right now, so I think that if any cause of destruction of civilian property might trigger a war or an armed conflict, and hence that will also be covered by IHL. Obviously, ICRC has this position that it will be covered by IHL, and many states are supporting them. Now there comes the third and a controversial part, which needs more discussion and research, which is when there is kinetic. There is no kinetic operation, but there is a cyber operation, which results into destruction of not a physical destruction of an asset, of civilian property or civilian object, but for example, civilian data.
Okay.
Or the functioning of some program, or for example, hacking of somebody's other country's tech system, or this civilian data of any sort has been hacked. Or
so, for example, the national identity database. Right? So
has
you get millions of citizens' data is hacked into. Would that come into this category?
Now that's a question whether we will deal the civilian data in the similar terms as we deal with civilian objects, other civilian objects. But the point is that actually it can affect the day-to-day lives of people, and hence it has the same effect as like a destruction of a hospital or of a power plant. So if the data of a hospital has been destroyed, or it will have the same impact. You will stop surgeries, you will not be able to carry out any sort of function, or at least some of the function, and it can actually result into deaths.
Absolutely.
But if there is no physical destruction or no that has been caused,
direct
but then
death.
So then you have to then there is a debate whether it will still be triggering an armed conflict or not, whether IHL will be applicable or not. So this is where ICRC still believes that independent cyber operation have the capacity, and the technology is such an advanced level, and it will even grow further in the future, that they will independently be able to start an armed conflict, and these without even destroying, causing a physical destruction, because data is now, for example, civilian data is as important as anything that civilians are dependent on. So over the banking data, because this is like how people do their transactions today.
Absolutely.
So any sort of destruction of their data will impact their lives, and so this is a debatable point. There's more research that needs to be done. This is a question that academics are discussing world over, but ICRC's position is that probably IHL is also applicable in such conditions.
No, it's a very, very fascinating debate discussion that's taking place, and it's very exciting to see some of the developments that are taking place in this regard. And I certainly do feel that without countries coming together to develop some consensus on how to regulate this, we are going to be facing problems in the future.
Absolutely, and I think for states like ours, it is important to have our internal discussions and put forward the best argument that serves us best, because not for just because we live in a particular region, volatile region, but regardless, we have to contribute and make a policy decision and contribute in the development of these principles, which will govern our lives in the near future.
Absolutely, and Pakistan as a state, and generally even South Asia, needs to be playing a far greater role in getting our message across and participating, engaging in the debate.
Absolutely.
At least, and I think that's something that we've been currently lacking.
Absolutely.
But it's certainly an area where we need. The final point, I wanted to discuss lethal autonomous weapon systems. This, especially when it comes to restrictions on the means and methods of warfare, is a particular concern I think that people are having. And again, the debate is developing as we speak. So could you maybe give us your thoughts on that?
So autonomous weapons, lethal autonomous weapons and fully autonomous weapons, where once the system has been activated, they can choose their own targets and take action. That's actually a problematic area where people have concerns and genuine concerns about machines taking decisions which are fundamentally taken by human beings, and especially when it involves lives of civilians, especially.
Absolutely.
So if there is a autonomous weapon which has capacity to target civilians, people consider, a lot of scholars think that such autonomous weapons should be banned. And then, regardless of whether they are trained only to target military objects or combatants, even then they can make mistakes. So in that regard, scholars do think that fully autonomous weapons should be banned, and there should be humans in some sort of loop, and the major decisions should be taken by human beings. Otherwise, there will be a problem, and there will be not only legal issues, but moral and ethical issues. And obviously, we need to have more discussion and more research on this topic and see how the law should be developed. Regardless, people also believe that once any autonomous weapon has been approved and is in accordance with the principle, because technology is developing, and there will be developments and there will be more new versions of it. So ICRC and scholars support the idea that any design, they constantly should be reevaluated and see how they are being developed and how they are performing, because otherwise it would be impossible for us to make sure that these autonomous weapons remain within the prescribed limits of IHL. So we have to make sure that again, the same principle of proportionality, distinction, the autonomous weapons are designed in a way that they don't violate those principles. However, the machine learning and the marvels of it can do wonders. And because they have this, because autonomous weapons or robots or machines do not have the inherent hatred for other communities or people, and they're the neutral in that way. However, they take decisions on the basis of data, which might be true in 10 times, but for the 11th time it might be wrong. So then you have to be careful, and then this the profiling system. It's also the problem with the programs, the design of the program, because you are describing terrorists and combatants in a particular shape and color and distinction and features.
So essentially the bias of the programmer
exactly
could feed into the system.
Absolutely. So these are the problems, and these are the ethical questions that people are discussing world over, and the debate is also ongoing at the UN. ICRC has contributed in the debate, states are contributing the debate, and I think there's much more that has to be discussed and finalized, and for sure there's a need for binding rules that states should follow. But this is something that that challenges lawyers every day, because technology is changing every day, and you have to keep up with it, and you have to make sure that you have rules in place, a general rule in place that which are already there, obviously, but you have to be make sure that you have to update them and make sure that they are more aligned with the needs of the time. If right now the position of some scholars is, at least in ICRC, is that the lethal autonomous weapon targeting civilians should be banned.
No, I think and it's essentially I wouldn't even say preemptive ban now, because it's been used.
Yeah,
you've had the use of
states are using it.
Lethal autonomous weapon systems, and many people say that it's very good. But I think one of the biggest concerns we're having is the accountability. Yeah, right. Who do you hold accountable if a robot goes and commits a war crime?
That's a problem. The problem with cyber also, that the question of attribution. That it can be a false flag and trigger a war, because it take time to attribute who has the attack generated from which place, or originated from which place, and you can see the proxies. It might seem that one country has generated the attack has generated from a particular country, but actually it has been diverted from another country.
Absolutely.
So even in cyber, there's a question of attribution and problem of attribution, and same is with the autonomous weapons, which is who will be held accountable in case autonomous weapon commits war crimes or violations, heinous violations of IHL. In that particular case, I think a lot of people have asked about whether the military which has asked to design that, the company which has designed it, or the military which has commissioned it, or the programmer which has made the program, or the person who has activated the weapon system. So there are a lot of questions that need to be answered. Obviously, those people who are policy makers and decision makers, the leadership positions, will be held accountable regardless whether the things are war crimes are committed by robots or the foot soldiers. But again, there is also a debate, and there are no binding rules with regard to that also. And we haven't have any jurisprudence on that also. So, that's
yeah, but this is something we expect in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
To certainly be something that arises there. Dr. Saadia, thank you so much for joining us.